There's not a day that goes by where we don't have to make a multitude of decisions. Some days we can feel harassed by all the decisions that we have to make, but this is a particular ego ploy to stop us from remembering who we are and our function of forgiveness. And I'd like to read from lesson 64, Let Me Not Forget My Functions. And this is what it has to say. The purpose of the world you see is to obscure your function of forgiveness and provide you with a justification for forgetting it. So even as a course student who knows that their function in the world is forgiveness, sometimes what's going on out there in the world, all the problems you might feel that have to be solved, or the decisions you have to make, seems so important and so dire that you feel justified in forgetting about forgiveness. That passage goes on to say the temptation to not practice forgiveness and to think, okay, I've got to focus on this decision out there and become really analytical or world-focused and forget about forgiveness being the only purpose for anything that we do out there in the world. This is what it has to say. This is the temptation to abandon God and His Son. So every temptation to no longer see the prime thing to be done in anything is to practice forgiveness first and foremost. Any temptation to let go of that and think, all right, I've just got to make this decision out there and do it on my own, that is without the Holy Spirit's guidance or Jesus' guidance, is a temptation to abandon God and His Son, capital S, meaning our spiritual self and everybody else's spiritual self as part of that sonship. So I'm going to read more from lesson 64. So from paragraphs 4 and 5, I'll select the following. Only by fulfilling the function given you by God will you be happy. So only by practicing forgiveness will you be happy. Not by choosing the right choice out there. Not by that being your focus. That won't make you happy no matter what you choose. And we'll get a little bit into why that is the case later. But only by having forgiveness foremost in your mind as the purpose for any decision you make out there will you be happy. That is because your function is to be happy by using the means by which happiness becomes inevitable. That means is forgiveness. There is no other way. There is no other way to be happy. Therefore, every time you choose whether or not to fulfill your function, you are really choosing whether or not to be happy. So even though you think that you're making a choice out there and that's the most important thing, don't forget that the most important thing is actually healing. It's to choose your function of forgiveness and let that be expressed through whatever is going on in your life out there and whatever choices you are making. Let us remember this today. Prepare yourself in advance for all the decisions you will make today by remembering they are all really very simple. Each one will lead to happiness or unhappiness. Let not the form of the decision deceive you. Complexity of form does not imply complexity of content. So although the decision you might need to make out there in the world seems very, very difficult, complex, so much to do, don't forget that the simplicity of salvation is to practice forgiveness, to let Jesus be your guide through that decision-making process. But that means letting it be a means for practicing forgiveness. And again, we'll get into how that happens a little later. Let not the form of the decision deceive you. Complexity of form does not imply complexity of content. It is impossible that any decision on earth can have a content different from just this one simple choice. That is the only choice the Holy Spirit sees. Therefore, it is the only choice there is. So that choice between unhappiness or happiness. And that is reflected in whether we choose to make forgiveness our goal or not. So let's talk a bit about the choices we think we have when we're not thinking about forgiveness. So I'm reading from a section called The Real Alternative. Real choice is no illusion, but the world has none to offer. So it's saying that a choice between A or B out there, if that is your focus, choosing between A or B happening or getting A or B, that is no real choice. Be not deceived by all the different names the world's roads are given. They have but one end, and each is but the means to gain that end, for it is here that all its roads will lead, however differently they seem to start, however differently they seem to go, their end is certain, for there is no choice among them. So what the Course is saying here is that when your focus is on choosing between things out there in the world and making that be the most important thing, what you are choosing for, whether you choose A or B or C, it doesn't matter. You're choosing the ego's end because you've made the world real and you're saying that the most important thing is something that I get or something that I choose out there. So by making the world real, you've made separate interests real, and you will experience, in the end, you will experience some form of suffering and dissatisfaction with what you choose. You might feel good in the beginning, but as the path goes along, as time goes by, your decision will not make you happy no matter what you choose, because you did it with the ego and you would have done it with separate interests. There would have been some feeling of what I gain, somebody else loses, or what they gain, I lose. So you'll either feel deprived or you feel that you had to sacrifice. So there is, in the Course's way, there is no choice at all. Either way, both roads, it says, leads to death. So that means the thought system of death, which is the ego thought system, in which there's no life, there's no joy, there's only sorrow, pain, and whatever else sounds really negative. That is the ego's end in the end. So a little bit further on in the Real Alternative, the learning that the world can offer but one choice, the end, the negative, the thought system of death, kill or be killed, all that kind of thing, is the beginning of acceptance that there is a real alternative instead. That real alternative is to practice forgiveness. Let me not forget my function, as we were saying with lesson 60, let's see what it was, lesson 64. Let me not forget my function of forgiveness. But then the Real Alternative section goes on in a way that emphasises that when we do forget our function and forget what's most important when dealing with the world out that we perceive outside of us, when we forget that healing and forgiveness, which also means perception of shared interests, when we forget that that is our function and the most important thing in any scenario, we're actually abandoning God and we're abandoning that spiritual self, as we saw a bit earlier. So this is what the Real Alternative says. He has not left his thoughts, but you forgot his presence and remembered not his love when you forget your function. You cannot escape from what you are, for God is merciful and did not let his Son abandon him. So even though We feel that we have abandoned God whenever we don't remember our function, or when we don't choose our function first and foremost. We'll know that we believe on some level that we have abandoned God because we will not feel good. And we won't feel good in our decision that we make out there because on some level it would have had that idea of gain and winners and losers, of sacrifice and deprivation. And so we won't feel good about that. We'll feel guilty or shameful about whatever our role was in that transaction. Life becomes very transactional when we're dealing with it with the ego. Everything becomes like a business transaction. And that's why I think the global political situation at the moment can be a great way of getting in touch with the shame and the guilt that we have personally over the sense of how transactional we actually are in our daily lives. And also with that ontological or mythological belief in how we were transactional with God. So there's a big thing at the moment politically about abandoning allies or abandoning people in their time of stress. And yes, that's a horrible thing. If you've ever felt abandoned by people who, said they'd always have your back, that can feel really awful. But notice your judgments about that whole issue of abandonment. And if it is a trigger for you, seeing it being played out there on the public forum in the world, it's an opportunity to reflect or to ask for forgiveness in how we always so often abandon or accuse ourselves of abandoning Jesus, abandoning God, and abandoning our spiritual self time and time again as our mind wanders into the world and becomes attached to doing things our way, to doing things in a very, a transactional way, managing the credits and balances in our mind over different actions and how people will respond. If we can forgive ourselves for letting go of Jesus' hand during the day, that will help change our perceptions of what's going on out there in the world. That will help us not be so triggered by what happens in the world. And that is regardless of any actions we take on the outside. So what can it look like when we're making decisions on our own without Jesus' help and without forgiveness and healing being our primary motivation? Well, I think there is a study that was done many years ago by Mr. Schwartz, or Professor Schwartz, into decision making regarding purchases. So this comes from the field of economics, and he came up with a division of two major groups of people when it came to making purchasing decisions, and he called those groups of people maximizers and satisficers. So what he found was that people who are maximizers, they are people who are concerned with making the best decision. And what happens is, as the number of choices increase between, say, a line of products, the more products you get, the more bamboozled, stressed, and least likely to actually make a decision are the maximizers. The maximizers are so concerned with making a right decision, the best decision, that they have to consider all the choices. They feel they have to consider all the choices, and then by then they're really bamboozled. There's a lot of analytical thinking going on, and if they do make a choice, Schwartz found that they often make better choices than satisficers, but they also can have a lot of buyer's remorse if they find or feel that they didn't make a good choice. And they often do some research after they've bought something. I'll put my hand up here, that's why I'm laughing, because they'll often do some research afterwards just to make sure that they made the best decision. And if they find that they didn't, and that might be because of price, that might be because of quality, whatever, they find something else they like better, they'll experience buyer's remorse. Now, the satisficers are very different. The satisficers are just concerned with making a purchase, and they're after what's good enough. That'll do. And they get it. So if they saw a whole line of products, say 50 different types of jam, they wouldn't feel like the maximizer that they had to pick or try every one. They wouldn't feel pressured about making the absolute best choice. They'd just be like, okay, let me just find something that I like. And they'd get it and they'd go home and they'd be fine. The studies generally say that the satisficers experience more well-being or a sense of well-being than the maximizers. But all things considered, the satisficers' choices tend to be not the best. So where the maximizer, if they do choose something, on the whole, they will choose a really good thing for whatever they want. The satisficers often choose something that ends up being not quite right, doesn't really do the job or whatever. But the thing is, they don't have buyer's remorse when they discover this. They're just like, yeah, whatever. And on they go to another purchase. So they're quite happy to move on and buy something else and see if that does the trick, and then buy something else and see if that does the trick. They make more purchases, but not so good ones. These guys make less purchases, but they tend to be of better quality or a better fit for purpose, for what they want it for. Now, I have gone on and added some other things to the maximizer satisficer binary here that Schwartz didn't, but I'm going to add it in from my particular framework of A Course in Miracles, and from reading that I've done on shame and guilt based on the psychoanalytical tradition. And I would say maximizers may be more guilt prone. So they're concerned with making the wrong decision. And if you look at it from A Course in Miracles metaphysical perspective, they are like, okay, the choice to leave heaven was the wrong decision. Now I don't want to make another bad choice. And so that's why choices are such a serious matter for them. Even purchasing products, it's such a serious matter. And they need to feel that they've made the right choice. Otherwise, it's quite anxiety producing. But because of the maximizers or this identification with guilt, a lot of that research and so forth, it's very tiring and a lot of work. That can play into the idea of sacrifice. So the guilt-prone person, guilt demands something to mitigate punishment in the future. So the guilt-prone person can do a lot more work than they have to around buying something that they need, because it's like assuaging the guilt of actually getting something that they want. Guilt demands sacrifice as a way of working off a sense of sin. Now, for satisficers, I would say that the feeling of emptiness for feeling no longer a part of God's oneness is the thing that's at play. And so there's a sense of shame, because shame is about comparing yourself to something and feeling lesser than. So you no longer feel the magnitude of yourself, of a complete self. You feel something less than. And so the satisficer can make more impulsive decisions because there's a need to, that making a decision isn't hard because there's no guilt around it, there's no fear of sin, there's no fear of retribution and a need to sacrifice. There is a need to fill up, to somehow replace this feeling of emptiness. So they somehow feel deprived. So if you get something and you find it's not a good fit, you won't feel, oh no, what have I done? You'll just be on to the next thing. Well, so how do I fill this hole? So how do I fill it? So you'll get something else. So there's more impulsive buying, more frequent buying. And yeah, I'd say the feeling of deprivation is more a concern for satisficers, and the feeling of sacrifice is more a concern for maximizers. Even if maximizers do get something that they want, like you can find that it gets broken or they self-sabotage just to ward off the sense of guilt and of punishment. Oh, I got something that I liked in the world. Oh no, God might come and get me for being so happy with this world I've created and what I've got for it. And so guilt can demand that we self-sabotage and break this wonderful thing that we just got, just so God won't punish us. And both of these tendencies in relation to making decisions are within all of us. And one is generally our habitual way, but we can shift between both ways depending on the circumstances and depending on how long we've been trying to make a decision and we've been engaged in that mindset. We can get to a stage where we've had enough of it and we flip. I think a good example of this is when we're driving and we come to, say, a T intersection and we're waiting for the traffic to go before we can turn in front of it and head on down the road. And let's say you think, oh, I've got all the time in the world. I can see that I possibly could go now, but it's not a big deal. I'll wait till there's a bigger gap and I can just cruise on out. And so you're waiting and a few cars go by and then you could have gone but you didn't, and because you had all the time in the world, well then all of a sudden it gets busy and then there's lots of cars and you're waiting and you're like, oh my goodness, how long do I have to wait now? And you start feeling a lot of this. Your time's being sacrificed. You don't want to wait anymore. You missed your opportunity. And now you start entering into a whole different mindset where you're like, okay, enough is enough. I want to go. And so you zoom out in just a good enough space where you think, okay, this could be a bit tricky, but if I boot it, I'll make it in. And perhaps people toot their horns. So you've hit the impulsive one, you've come into the impulsive zone and you've gone on. Well, it can be the same with the whole decision-making process in other areas of life. You're doing the maximising thing until you just get tired of it. And what you'll do, you make a rash choice. Hopefully it doesn't lead to any catastrophe or anything, but you then step out of character and you do something that you otherwise might not have done. And that's why you've been stuck in that sacrificial mindset. And with the satisficer, if they go on and on buying things, making, lots and lots of choices and still not getting what they want, eventually they'll get sick of that too. And what they might do though is just become really defeated and depressed at the thought that they cannot fill that hole, and so they might end up in quite a slump of inertia and depression. And that's where actually making decisions becomes hard from them, not for this sense of making the wrong choice, but but that there is no choice. Maybe nothing's going to fill that hole. And that's when the Course says that this very, very low point is a kind of a necessity to get to see that there is nothing in the world that will fill that hole. But it's good to get there because there is an answer, and that is the Course's way. That is, let's practice forgiveness. And Jesus takes our hand and helps us see that there is another way. So with this in mind, I'm turning to lesson 155, called I Will Step Back and Let Him Lead the Way. Him meaning God or Jesus or the Holy Spirit. And this is from paragraph 5, and it's talking about the path of believing that the world holds something that you want. So there is something out there that will fill the hole, that will do it for you, that will make you feel happy. Or the path that says, it's more about sacrifice. I must not find happiness in the world. So even if the maximizer, like I said, finds something that they like, it's like, oh no, I mustn't do that, because that's sinful to find something in the world pleasing or satisfying. So this is what that section has to say about those two ways that I've applied to maximizers and satisficers and the decision-making process. If truth demanded they give up the world, that'll be these guys, it would appear to them as if it asked the sacrifice of something that is real. So the thing is that people who believe, I just got to not enjoy the things of the world. Well, we still believe the world is real though, that's the thing. So as long as you say to yourself, I don't need the things of the world, but you believe the world is real, you will feel that a sense of sacrifice, that you're not enjoying something that you could be. Many have chosen to renounce the world while still believing its reality, and they have suffered from a sense of loss and have not been released accordingly. Others have chosen nothing but the world, and they have suffered from a sense of loss still deeper, which they did not understand. Between these paths is another road that leads away from loss of every kind, for sacrifice and deprivation both are quickly left behind. This is the way appointed for you now. And the way that the Course provides between these two paths, the way that lifts us above those two paths, is forgiveness, our function of forgiveness. So when you come to a place where you need to decide what is the best product, what is the best course of action, the best, or the one that will relieve you of your sense of deprivation and relieve you of the need to feel sacrificial, the best in those regards is to practice forgiveness. I'd put that here if I had a pen. Forgiveness. And in that way, you no longer see yourself in opposition to people. You no longer feel guilty for what you purchase, for what you get, because when you were purchasing it, you weren't thinking that you were getting something at the cost of somebody else, that as you bought something, that person wasn't losing, or other people weren't losing because the product was no longer available for them. And on this side, you don't feel shame. You won't experience shame when the object that you got doesn't live up to your expectations. It doesn't fill you up. See, if you came from this position of lack when you bought something, nothing can replace that sense of lack that comes from not identifying with your spiritual self. And so getting that thing and trying to fill yourself up with it will only reinforce your sense of shame. However, if forgiveness is your goal, then when you do make that purchase, you'll experience a sense again of shared interests with whoever you are dealing with. And it's that experience of shared interests that will help you remember your wholeness. So that will fill you up, not the product that you get, but the interaction. That forgiveness was the goal. That is what will relieve you of this sense and give you what you truly want. So in both these circumstances, when forgiveness isn't at the forefront of our mind, it's that entering into the ego's thought system of lack, scarcity. That is what the problem is. And that is what will mean that either choice from either of these positions will lead to the same end, whether we choose A or B or whatever. The same end, the ego's thought system of death. But there's another way. So let forgiveness be your goal in anything that you do, and ask for help to experience shared interests and healing. And that way you'll step out of this zone and be lifted above the battleground in which everybody's personal interests are at odds with everybody else's. I hope this has been helpful. Tune in again. Bye-bye.